What would you do if the very man you served with loyalty became the one who hunted you down? If every shadow in the wilderness whispered betrayal, and every step tested your faith, would you still believe you were chosen by God? In our last episode, David's triumph over Goliath echoed like a hymn of victory across Israel. But with glory comes peril. Driven into the wilderness by the wrath of a jealous king, David becomes a fugitive, caught between the shadows of betrayal and the light of his divine calling. How does a man chosen by God navigate the trials of exile? And what unfolds when he comes face to face with the king who seeks his life? Join us as we journey through the caves and deserts, where a shepherd turned warrior discovers leadership in adversity and faith refined by the fire of hardship.
Looking back, it feels like a dream. How could the son of Jesse, a simple shepherd from Bethlehem, rise to become the anointed king of Israel? Yet even in the quietest moments of tending my father's sheep, I felt the Lord's presence shaping my heart and preparing me for a destiny I could never have imagined. I spent my youth in the fields, under the open skies, where I learned to rely on God's guidance. I remember the stillness of the nights, broken only by the rustle of the wind or the distant howl of a wolf. There were dangers, of course, the lions, the bears, but each time they threatened my flock, I found courage not my own. My sling became an extension of my faith, and every victory was a testament to the God who protected me and the sheep under my care. Then came the day Samuel arrived in Bethlehem. I hadn't been called to the feast with my brothers. I was the youngest, the least important in my father's eyes. But the Lord sees differently. When Samuel poured the oil over my head and declared me the chosen one of the Lord, I felt the weight of something far greater than myself. The Spirit of the Lord came upon me in a way I had never experienced before. It wasn't just an anointing, it was a calling, though I didn't yet know where it would lead. The years that followed were a blur of moments both grand and harrowing. I was summoned to Saul's court, my harp a balm for his troubled spirit. I played for him, sang songs born of my time in the fields, and for a time it seemed as though I had found favor. But then came Goliath. The giant's mocking voice still echoes in my mind. He defied not just Israel, but the living God. I couldn't stand by while he taunted our people. The memory of that battlefield is as clear now as it was then. The jeers of the Philistines, the fear in the eyes of Israel's soldiers, and my own steps, steady, yet filled with a confidence that could only come from the Lord. I carried no sword, no shield, only my sling and 5 smooth stones from the brook. It wasn't arrogance that propelled me forward, it was faith. The battle is the Lord's, I declared, and with a single stone the giant fell. The victory was not mine, it was his, yet that moment changed everything. My name was on the lips of every Israelite, and Saul's jealousy began to grow. The years as a fugitive were perhaps the most formative of my life, hiding in caves, fleeing from Saul's wrath, gathering a band of misfits who looked to me for leadership. It was there that I truly learned what it meant to trust in the Lord. Time and again I had opportunities to take Saul's life, to claim the throne that had been promised to me. But each time I held back. I will not touch the Lord's anointed, I told my men. The throne was not mine to take, it was God's to give. Those years taught me patience, humility, and dependence on the Lord. They also forged bonds with men who would stand by me for the rest of my life. I learned to lead not through power, but through service, through faith, and through unwavering trust in the God who had called me. When Saul fell on the battlefield at Mount Gilboa, my heart broke. He had been my king, my enemy, but also the Lord's anointed. I mourned for him, for Jonathan, my dearest friend, and for Israel. And when the people finally came to anoint me as king, I felt the weight of it all, the triumphs, the trials, the losses, and the promise of what was to come. The rise of David was not a story of ambition or conquest. It was a story of the Lord's faithfulness, of his power to lift the lowly and accomplish his purposes through the least likely of servants. And as I sat on the throne of Israel, I knew one thing above all. The kingdom was not mine. It was his. I never imagined my name would carry so far. Not when I was just a boy tending sheep under the wide sky, with nothing but the bleat of lambs and the whisper of the wind to keep me company. But here I was, riding through the streets of Israel, my name on the lips of the people. Their voices rose like a tide, singing songs that were both sweet and strange to my ears. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. The words rang out, bold and bright, echoing off the stone walls and into the hills beyond. I should have felt joy. Perhaps I did, in part. But more than anything, I felt the weight of it. For every cheer, every cry of my name, there was the shadow of Saul beside me. I glanced his way more than once, catching the tightness of his jaw, the forced smile that never reached his eyes. His hand gripped the reins too tightly. His knuckles cracked against the stile beside me. I wondered what he thought, what he saw when he looked at me. I wondered if he heard my name and felt the same pride I felt when I first stood before him, a shepherd boy with a sling and a handful of stones. But there was no pride in his gaze now, only something sharp and shadowed that I could not name. The people were so full of life, their faces alight with joy and hope. It was for them I had fought, for their freedom, their peace. I watched as children darted through the crowd, their laughter like bells, and women wove garlands of flowers to crown the procession. Yet even their joy could not still the unease in my heart. The songs were for me, yes, but they carried something more, something heavy that pressed against my spirit. When we reached the palace, the crowd began to thin, their voices fading into the evening air. Saul dismounted first, his movements stiff, his shoulders rigid with the strain of the day. I lingered, letting the moments stretch, watching the people return to their homes, their hearts lifted by the celebration. For them, this day was a victory, a promise of brighter days to come. For me, it was a reminder of how fragile such promises could be. That night the songs stayed with me, haunting the edges of my mind. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing their melody weave through the silence. I thought of Saul, of the way his gaze lingered on me, and I wondered if he, too, lay awake, hearing the same notes, but tasting them differently. I rose and moved to the window, letting the cool night air wash over me. The moonlights spilled over the hills, painting them in silver, and for a moment they thought of the pastures I had left behind. I longed for the simplicity of those days, for the quiet of the flock and the peace of the open sky. But those days were gone, and I could not go back. I whispered a prayer into the night, a prayer for Saul, for Israel, and for myself. I asked for strength, for clarity, for the courage to carry the weight of the songs and all they meant. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but I also knew that I would walk it, step by step, for the people who had placed their hope in me, and for the God who had called me to this journey. The palace no longer felt like the haven it once was. Its walls, once warm with the hum of music and the scent of burning incense, had grown cold. Even the air seemed different, thicker, heavier, pressing down on me as if the stones themselves carried the weight of the king's anger. Saul's eyes, once filled with fatherly pride, now lingered on me too long, his gaze sharp as a blade. He didn't need words. The tension between us spoke louder than anything he might say. I had always known Saul's moods could shift like the wind in the hills, sudden and fierce. When his spirit was troubled, I played my harp, and the melodies would ease his soul. But recently, even the music failed. My notes hung in the air, hollow, powerless against the growing darkness in his heart. The whispers started not long after. I heard them in the shadows of the palace corridors. "The king is not himself," they murmured. "He speaks of betrayal, of threats to his throne." I tried to ignore them. Saul was a man with burdens I couldn't fathom. I told myself it was nothing, just the strain of kingship. But the truth came one night, sudden and violent. I was playing for him, as I always did, my fingers moving over the strings, the music soft and soothing. Then, without warning, I saw the flash of metal in the corner of my eye. His spear flew past me, so close I felt the air tremble around it. It struck the wall with a force that rattled the room, its shaft quivering where it lodged in the stone. For a moment, I couldn't move. My hands froze over the harp strings, the final note dying in the tension-filled silence. I looked up, and there was Saul, his face twisted with rage, his breathing heavy, his hand already reaching for another weapon. I ran. My feet carried me through the halls I knew so well, my steps quick and silent. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat like the thunder of an oncoming storm. By the time I reached the courtyard, the cool night air struck my face, sharp and biting. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. Under the cover of darkness I slipped away. There was no ceremony, no farewell. I left with little more than the clothes on my back, a few provisions, my sling and my harp, a fragile reminder of a life that now seemed so distant. The songs that once filled these walls had turned against me, their echoes now haunting. The road stretched out before me, empty and uncertain. I thought of the songs the people had sung, the ones that had lifted me and, unknowingly, marked me as a threat. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. I had never sought their praise, but their words had planted seeds of jealousy in Saul's heart. Now those seeds had borne their bitter fruit. I walked into the wilderness, each step taking me further from the life I had known. I was no longer a warrior of the king's court, or a shepherd in the quiet hills. I was a fugitive, a man hunted by the one I had served so loyally. But even in the darkness of the night, I felt a strange resolve. The God who had delivered me from the lion and the bear, the God who had guided my hand against Goliath, was still with me. I clung to that faith as I stepped into the unknown, trusting that the path ahead, though perilous, was one he had prepared for me. The wilderness waited, vast and unyielding, its silence broken only by the crunch of my steps and the steady rhythm of my breathing. It was there I would be tested, stripped of everything but my faith. It was there I would learn what it truly meant to be a man after God's own heart. The wilderness stretched out before me, its vastness both a shield and a burden. The hills rolled in waves of stone and shadow, and the caves gaped like the mouths of giants. It was harsh and unforgiving, but it was also liberating, in a way the palace walls had never been. Here there was no pretense, no courtly whispers. Here a man could see himself clearly, or be broken by what he saw. At first I thought my flight from Saul would be a solitary journey. I welcomed the silence, the time to think and pray, to try to understand what God wanted from me. But the quiet didn't last. They began to come, one by one, and then in groups, men with faces carved by hardship, eyes haunted by the weight of their struggles. Some came with debts they could never repay, others with wounds too deep for words. They came not because I sought them, but because they had nowhere else to go. They called me their leader, though I hardly felt like one. I was just a fugitive like them, a man caught between what was and what might be. But when they looked at me, I saw something more. They weren't looking for a warrior or a king. They were looking for hope. And somehow they thought they'd found it in me. I listened to their stories, sitting around the fires that lit our nights. Their voices were rough, their words heavy with pain, but there was laughter too, sometimes. It would rise like a spark, unexpected and bright, before settling back into the solemn rhythm of our days. They were broken men, yes, but I saw something else in them, something that reminded me the stones in the riverbed, smoothed by the current, yet unyielding in their strength. We became a brotherhood, bound not by blood, but by trust. I taught them what I knew, how to fight, how to survive, but more than that, I tried to teach them why. We fight not for vengeance, I told them, but to protect the innocent, to stand for what is right. Those words felt heavy on my tongue, not because they were untrue, but because I knew how easily they could be forgotten in the heat of battle. The wilderness shaped us. Its harshness sharpened us. Its silence taught us to listen. The caves where we slept echoed with more than just the sound of training or laughter. They echoed with prayers, whispered into the night. I prayed too, more than I ever had before, not just for guidance, but for the strength to bear the weight of these men's hopes. They trusted me, and I could not let them down. Word of us spread. More came. Families seeking refuge, soldiers weary of Saul's madness, men and women looking for something they couldn't name. They brought with them their fears, their burdens, their dreams. And somehow we became more than just a band of outcasts. We became a people, a force, not just united by necessity, but by faith. At night, under the canopy of stars, I would play my harp. The notes carried through the hills, soft and steady, like a prayer made of music. My men would sit in silence, their faces turned toward the sound. I saw in their eyes the same thing I felt, a fragile hope, a belief that somehow, against all odds, we were walking a path that God Himself had laid before us. The wilderness was not an end. It was a beginning. What we built there was more than survival. It was a testament to what faith could do, to what God could do with broken men willing to trust Him. And though I did not know what lay ahead, I knew this: we were being prepared for something greater. The same God who had brought us to this place would carry us forward. Of that I was certain. The cave was damp, its air thick with the weight of earth and something deeper, a tension that hung in the silence like a held breath. I sat against the cold stone wall, my fingers brushing the hilt of my blade, as I listened to the whispers of my men. Their voices, usually steady and resolute, now carried an edge of urgency, like the hiss of a fire, not yet seen, but already felt. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves, its faint rustling barely reaching us, but we all knew what lay beyond the cave's dark mouth. Saul, my pursuer, my king, the man who had once called me his son. His camp lay sprawled in the valley below, unaware that his steps had brought him to the very cave where we now hid. It was almost absurd, this turn of events. The king, who had hunted me, the one whose spear I had fled so many times, now knelt not 20 paces away, his back to me, defenseless. My men saw it as providence, their whispers full of conviction. "The Lord has delivered him into your hands," one said. "Is your moment. End it, and we will follow you to the throne." I rose, my heart heavy with their expectations. They believed this was justice, the culmination of all we had endured, the nights of cold, the hunger, the relentless running. I wanted to believe it too. I wanted to see this as God's hand opening a path for me. But in my heart I felt a deeper truth, a still, small voice that stayed in my hand. Saul knelt before me, his figure barely visible in the cave's shadows. He looked so small then, not the towering figure of a king, but a man, weary and fragile. I crept closer, my steps careful, my breath shallow. My hand moved to my knife, but I did not strike. Instead, I cut a corner from his robe, the blade's sharpness a reminder of how easily this moment could have ended differently. As I retreated into the shadows, the fabric clenched in my hand. My men stared at me in disbelief. Their faces, lit faintly by the cave's filtered light, were a mix of confusion and frustration. "Why didn't you do it?" one finally asked, his voice sharp with the sting of dashed hope. I held up a scrap of cloth, its edges frayed but untacked. "I will not lay my hand on the Lord's anointed," I said, my voice steady despite the storm in my chest. "It is not for me to take what God has given. Let Him be the judge between us." Their murmurs faded into silence, and I stepped out into the light, the piece of Saul's robe in my hand. The valley opened before me, vast and still, as I called out, "My Lord, the King!" Saul turned, his face a mask of shock that softened as he saw me kneeling, holding out the cloth. "Today the Lord delivered you into my hands," I said, my voice firm but tinged with the weight of what could have been. "But I did not harm you. See this, my father, and know I bear no evil toward you. May the Lord judge between us, but my hand will not touch you." The silence that followed was profound, like the pause after a storm's first clap of thunder. Saul's shoulders sagged, the fight leaving him as he said, "You are more righteous than I. You have repaid me with good, though I sought your harm. May the Lord reward you for this mercy." He turned and left, his men following like shadows, their movements quiet against the enormity of the moment. When I returned to the cave, my men surrounded me, their faces still painted with disbelief. "You could have ended it," one said, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him, at all of them, their eyes searching mine for an answer that might make sense of what I had done. "The throne is God's to give, not mine to take," I said. "I will not become king by shedding the blood of the one He anointed." The cave felt different then, as if the air had shifted, lighter somehow. It was no longer just a place of hiding, it was a place of mercy. And as we settled back into the shadows, I knew this moment would stay with me, a reminder that God's way is rarely the easiest, but it is always right. The news came like a hammer blow, shaking me to my core. Saul was dead. The king who had pursued me with relentless fury, the man whose praise I had once cherished, had fallen in battle. And with him, Jonathan, my brother in spirit, my truest friend. I felt the weight of it before the words even settled in my ears. My heart broke, and I tore my garments, my cries filling the stillness of the wilderness. It felt as though the earth itself mourned with me. For all his flaws, I had loved Saul. How could I not? He was the Lord's anointed, the first king of Israel. I had seen his strength, his courage, and I had seen the shadow that crept over him, turning his heart to stone. Even then, I could not bring myself to harm him, though the opportunities had come more than once. I respected the mark of God upon him, and now that mark was gone. But it was Jonathan's loss that cut deepest. He had been my other half, a bond forged not by blood but by something even stronger. I wrote the lament for him and for Saul, with trembling hands, my tears staining the parchment. "How the mighty have fallen," I wrote, my voice breaking as I spoke the words aloud. "Jonathan, my brother, you were dear to me. Your love was wonderful, greater than the love of women. I let the grief take me for a time, but even as the tears fell, I knew the world would not wait for my mourning. Israel needed a king. The people needed direction, hope, and a leader to guide them through the storm that Saul's death had left behind. The whispers began before the dust had even settled. David, they said, he is the one, the anointed, the one who stood against Goliath. I had not sought the throne, it sought me. My men urged me to go to Hebron, and I could not refuse them. Hebron, a place of history, of Abraham and Isaac, of promises made and promises kept. When I arrived, the elders of Judah were waiting. Their faces were lined with weariness, their eyes searching mine for the strength they hoped to find. They bowed before me, not as rulers but as servants, and asked me to take the mantle of king. I knelt as they poured the oil over my head, the same oil Samuel had once poured when I was but a boy with a shepherd's staff. But this time, the weight was different. This was not the promise of a distant future. This was the burden of the present. The oil dripped down my face, its fragrance filling the air, a tangible reminder of God's presence and favor. I rose to their cheers, but my heart remained humble. The throne was not a reward, it was a calling, a seat of service, not power. I was chosen not for my victories, but for my faith, not for my strength, but for my heart. I knew the path ahead would be difficult. Rival factions, lingering enemies, a nation in need of healing. But I also knew that God had been faithful before, and He would be faithful again. As I stepped out of the hall in Hebron, the shouts of the people echoing around me, I looked up to the heavens. "The Lord is my shepherd," I whispered. The words that had carried me through the valleys and the battles, through the caves and the exile, I will follow where He leads. And so my reign began, not with triumph but with humility, not with conquest but with hope. Hope for a united Israel, for a people brought together under the guidance of the God who had never abandoned us. My heart was full of gratitude, and my resolve was steady. The journey was far from over, but I was ready to walk the path He had set before me. The sun rose over the hills, casting its golden light on the city of Jebus. It stood proud and defiant, its walls a challenge to anyone who dared dream of unity. For centuries, Jerusalem had been a fortress untouched by Israel, a symbol of division in a land meant to behold. But as I looked at its stone walls, I saw something more. A city that could unite the tribes, a place where God's promise could take root. The Jebusites laughed at us. Their voices echoed from atop the walls, mocking and jeering. "Even the blind and the lame can defend this city," they called, their confidence as high as their fortifications. But their words did not discourage me. If anything, they steeled my resolve. I studied the city, walking its perimeter. My thoughts were as steady as the rhythm of my steps. This was not a battle of might alone. It would take faith and determination. I called my men to me, their faces eager, their trust in me unwavering. "Whoever climbs through the water shaft and strikes the Jebusites first will command my army," I said. It was Joab who answered, bold and relentless. Under the cover of night, he led his men through the narrow, dark tunnels. I waited, the stillness of the night heavy around me, until the cry of victory broke the silence. By dawn, Jebus had fallen. I walked through the gates as the first light of day touched the stones. This city would no longer be Jebus. It would be Jerusalem, the city of David. But it was not for my name that it would stand. I saw in its streets and walls a future, a home for a united people, a place where God would dwell among us. Even as we strengthened the walls and expanded the city, my thoughts turned to the Ark of the Covenant. For too long it had been kept in the shadows, away from the heart of the nation. The Ark, the symbol of God's promise to Israel, belonged in Jerusalem. It would make the city complete, not through stone, but through the presence of the Almighty. The procession to bring the ark began with joy, my heart as light as my feet as I danced before it. I wore no royal robes that day, only the garments of a servant of God. The air was filled with music, the sound of harps and cymbals rising like a prayer. I danced with abandon, my spirit full of praise, leading the ark toward its new home. But joy turned to fear when Uzzah, one of the men guiding the ark, reached out to steady it and was struck down. The celebration halted, the weight of God's holiness pressing upon us. I questioned myself, my heart heavy with doubt. Was I worthy to bring the ark to Jerusalem? Could this city truly bear the presence of the Lord? After a time of reflection, I renewed my dedication, and the procession resumed. When the ark entered Jerusalem, it was with great rejoicing. I offered sacrifices and blessed the people, my heart filled with gratitude. The city, now home to the ark, was no longer just a capital. It was a testimony to what faith could achieve. That evening, I stood on the walls of Jerusalem, the city quiet after the day's celebrations. The ark rested in its tent at the heart of the city, and I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. The walls, the streets, the people, they were no longer just a collection of stones and souls. They were part of something greater. This city was not mine, it was God's, a place where heaven touched the earth, where the journey of a shepherd had found its purpose. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, I knew this: Jerusalem was the heart of that road, a city of promise, a city of God. The road to this moment had been long winding through the hills of Bethlehem, the caves of Adullam, and the fields where Goliath fell. Every step of the way I had felt the hand of God, sometimes as a guiding touch, other times as a weight too heavy to bear alone. And now, as I stood atop the walls of Jerusalem, the city stretched out before me, I understood that the journey was far from over. Jerusalem, the city of David, they called it. Its walls, newly fortified, stood not just as barriers, but as symbols of hope, unity, and the presence of God. Within those walls rested the Ark of the Covenant, the heart of our faith, its presence a reminder of the promises that had carried us through generations of struggle. And yet, I knew that the work was incomplete. In my heart, a vision burned, not for my glory, but for His. I dreamed of a temple, a dwelling place for the ark more permanent than a tent, a place where all Israel could come to worship the Lord. I prayed about it, planned for it, and imagined its halls and courtyards filled with the songs of our people. But even as I dreamed, I began to sense that this task would not be mine to complete. The Lord had brought me here, yes, but I understood now that my role was not to build, but to prepare. The temple would come through another, a future generation, and though I would not see it with my own eyes, the promise of it would shape everything I did from this day forward. I knew the road ahead would test me as the road behind had. There would be moments of triumph, yes, but also failures that would humble me to my core. My faith, my character, and my very soul would be stretched in ways I could not yet imagine. But through it all, I clung to the covenant, a reminder that God's plans were greater than my own, and that His promises stretched far beyond my lifetime. As the sun dipped low, bathing Jerusalem in the warm light of dusk, I turned from the view and lifted a quiet prayer. Lord, You have brought me this far not by my strength, but by Yours. Guide me as I lead Your people. Let my reign reflect Your glory, not mine. And so I stepped away from the wall, the city behind me alive with the hum of its people. I was a shepherd no longer, nor just a king. I was a man entrusted with a legacy, a thread in a story far greater than my own. This was not the end of my journey, but the beginning of something far deeper, a legacy of faith that would echo through generations, pointing toward the eternal kingdom promised through my line. The boy who once watched over sheep had become a king. But my greatest calling remained, to be a man after God's own heart, a servant of His enduring purpose.
From hunted fugitive to merciful leader, David's trials in the wilderness shaped him for the throne. But even with Saul gone, His path to becoming king is paved with sacrifice and challenges. What did you learn from David's faith in the face of betrayal? Tell us in the comments and give this video a thumbs up if it spoke to you. Share it with someone who needs encouragement today. And don't forget to subscribe to God's Story. There's so much more to come in David's incredible journey.